Vandaag hebben we een hoorzitting met professor Jean Muller van de Universiteit van Lausanne, die ons wegwijs zal maken in het Zwitserse federalisme. Mevrouw Genet heeft zich laten verontschuldigen. Ik stel voor dat we professor Muller laten starten met zijn toelichting. Dus professor, als u er klaar voor bent, dan krijgt u het woord.
Recording in progress.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation, which I take to be a great privilege that you are interested in Swiss federalism and allow me to present to you an appraisal that is a small introduction of how the system is structured, and then a few points that I think work well and some points that are not working well. As always, there's no perfect system, not even in Switzerland. If you have any questions that relate to the understanding of anything I'm saying, I'm happy to take them directly during the presentation. Otherwise, I think we have enough time after I speak in about 20-25 minutes to group the questions and I can answer then. So I will be speaking a lot about the Swiss cantons. If you don't know what a canton is, imagine them to be bread. Okay, so every canton is represented here by a different bread. They're all breads, they're all tasty, but every bread is a bit different. Some are hard, some are soft, some are a bit on the darker side, on the lighter side, longer, rounder, etc. That's basically Swiss federalism for you. Different breads in different parts that somehow all work together, but yet each bread fiercely and jealously guards its own autonomy. If you've never been to Switzerland and have no idea what I'm talking about, it's not so different from Belgium. So two countries are about the same size, more or less, two small countries with about the same number of inhabitants. So at least that's not so much of a stretch if I ask you now to think about Switzerland for the next 20 minutes. So in a nutshell, the Swiss Federation has been in existence in its current form since 1848. So it's quite a long time. It's called one of the classic federations together with the United States, with Canada, with Germany, Australia, because they've been around for so long. So that already gives you some of the contrast to what I've just said, that Belgium and Switzerland are very much alike, because actually they're not so much alike, because the Swiss evolution, and I'll show you the details in a moment, has been towards ever more centralization, whereas, as you know much better than I do, the Belgian evolution has been towards much greater decentralization or federalization or even confederalization. I understand some of the debates go in that direction as well. But basically the Swiss system is fairly simple. 3 levels. So the top level is the federal level. We call it confederation, although it's a federation and not a confederation. Then there are the breads, the 26 cantons, and at the lowest level, there are some 2,000 municipalities. There is no distinction, no legal distinction between large municipalities and cities and very small ones. Every municipality is a municipality. Of course, in actual fact, a city such as the city of Zurich with 500,000 inhabitants can do a lot more and has a lot greater weight than the smallest municipality with 150 inhabitants. But legally speaking, they're all alike. Now, the second point, what kind of federalism is the Swiss Federation? It basically adopted the German model of so-called administrative federalism or Verwaltungsföderalismus, which means that the upper level, the national level, legislates, decides on what needs to be done, but it's the lower levels, the cantons, and sometimes even the municipalities that actually implement those decisions. A consequence of that is that the federal level has a very small public administration. There are only 40,000 people employed in the central administration, properly speaking, because most of the staff, the controls in the restaurants during COVID, whether they adhere to the standards, this is cantonal or even local police or staff that implement the federal laws. The lower level are also very autonomous in other regards. So the lower levels not only implement what the higher level decides, a bit like the EU member states and the EU, but the lower levels, the cantons and the municipalities also have their own autonomy, their own resources, so they can go beyond and do different things across the territory. Again, a consequence of that is because there are so many players that the evolution and policymaking has been very slow. So Switzerland is not the country of revolutions, anything but. It's really a country of evolutionary, slow policymaking. It takes a long time to enact a law, 10 years on average, because there are so many veto players. Not just the cantons, but also the parties, obviously. So over time, the federal government, the cabinet, the executive of the whole country, it has remained a 7-member institution. So ever since 1848, the number 7 was defined in the constitution. The Swiss government has 7 members. They all have the same powers, but over time, different parties have been included. So at the moment, and since 1959, actually, 4 parties have members in the executive. And ever since 1848, the different language groups have been more or less proportionally represented. I'll talk about languages later on, but basically it's not the case that there is a hard quota for the different language groups, but it's more an informal rule that the different language groups should over time be adequately represented. Now, below the federal government, so who elects the federal government? It's the 2 chambers of the federal parliament, the National Council, the lower chamber, which is supposed to represent the Swiss nation, National Council, and the Senate or the Council of States, which is supposed to represent the cantons, the federal dimensions, 246 members. In a joint session, these 246 members of parliament elect the federal government. So as you'll see also in a minute, there is diversity in terms of the different cantons, the breads, but there is also diversity in terms of the parties. So here is the current composition of the Swiss parliament, the federal parliament, so the 2 chambers, the National Council, the lower house with 200 members, and the 46 members of the Senate. You see that the party proportion, the party strengths are more or less identical. The center is stronger in the Senate, whereas the pole parties, the left and the Greens and the Conservatives on the right are stronger in the National Council. Now, what is important to keep in mind, since we talk about federalism today, is that the constituencies, so the electoral districts within which both types of members of parliament are elected, are again the cantons. So even if we talk about national elections, we fall back onto the cantons. The cantons are the districts within which electoral competition takes place. It's not the language groups, it's not larger regions as you would have it in Belgium at the moment, but it's 26 mini elections in the different parts of the country for both chambers of parliament. That's the government in its current composition. So you have these 7 members that come from currently 3 different languages, 1 Italian speaking. The president actually at the moment is Italian speaking, 2 French speaking members, and 4 Swiss German speakers make up the executive at the moment. Party-wise, we have 2 social democrats, 1 Christian Democrat in the center, 2 liberal that are more on the right economically, but progressive culturally, and 2 conservatives, the largest party represented here at the moment. And of course, again, the cantons. I told you I will speak a lot about the cantons. The 7 members of the government, they come from 7 different cantons. Guy Parmelin is from the canton of Vaud, French-speaking canton. The current president, Ignacio Cassis, is from the southernmost canton, canton of Ticino, and then you have people from the other cantons. I darkened out the chancellor because that's really just a secretary general of the federal government and not a minister as such. So since we talked about language, here is the distribution of the language groups in Switzerland. Basically, you have the German-speaking majority, 62%. You have the largest minority, the French speakers, 23%, concentrated in the West. You have the Italian speakers, 8% at the moment, concentrated in the South. And you have a very small fourth national language group, Romansh, which is a kind of Latin dialect, scattered in the Alpine mountains of one canton, Canton of Grisons, here in the east. They're only 0.5% of the total population. You see that others make up 22%, but because the idea here is to protect and recognize historic, territorially anchored language groups, they have been upgraded to the status of fourth national language in the Second World War under pressure from the Nazi and from the fascist regimes to the north and to the south. Now, what is important to keep in mind is that these language groups, they exist here on the map and in the minds of people, but there is no legal recognition whatsoever of these language groups. Legally speaking, they don't exist. Of course, politically speaking, they not only exist, but they have, depending on the policy issue, a huge impact on what do people want. So during the COVID pandemic, French-speaking citizens and politicians were a lot quicker to demand regulations, whereas the German speakers were a lot more hesitant and more towards the side of let's protect the economy, let's not force people to get vaccinated, and so on and so forth. So there are cultural differences, but I'll speak about that later on. They have never become a major issue in politics because of, amongst others, federalism. You see that the cantonal borders, they cut across the language groups. So the language groups actually only live through the cantons. So each language group has at least one canton, but oftentimes several more cantons where politics is done, where the money is, where people run for elections, where issues arise. So the largest group, the Swiss Germans, are scattered over 19 cantons. So 18 cantons are purely monolingual German, and one canton has a very large majority of German speakers. Total population is 6 million. And here I added just some cultural and economic indicators. So what's the share of Catholics in that group? It's 41%. What's the average unemployment? It's 2%. What's the average per capita GDP across those cantons? It's 83,000. This is just to highlight you that there are no major differences between the language groups. You find Catholics everywhere, unemployment is low everywhere, and everybody is more or less rich, although actually the Italian speaking, the second largest minority, they are the richest on this per capita basis. But other than that, differences are minor. So neither the economy nor religion, which historically has played a role, overlaps with the linguistic cleavage. We call this cross-cuttingness. The French minority is scattered over 6 cantons. So 4 cantons are purely Francophone. 2 cantons have a French-speaking minority. There is one canton here, I added it here because it has a French minority of only 4 or 5%. So it's really not a French-speaking canton, whereas these 6 are typically considered the French-speaking cantons. And then Italian is spoken in Canton of Ticino, and the Canton of Grisons is 1/3 Italian because it's a trilingual canton. All this just to highlight you that the language groups do not exist as such, but it's through the cantons where they are concentrated that they come to life and that they make policy and become a relevant issue. Now, this is in stark contrast, obviously, to the Belgian case. There's one exception, public TV and radio. So there is a public TV and radio company with 4 subsidiaries. So the entire company is divided into 4. There is a German-speaking branch, if you want. There is a French-speaking sub-company. There is an Italian-speaking sub-company, and there is a Romansh-speaking sub-company. So each language group gets its own public TV and radio sub-company on top of its territory. And there is even a small fiscal equalization. So because the largest part is also the richest part here, the German-speaking part. Some of the money that is raised through the TV license is distributed to the smaller companies. So the German speakers co-fund, the German-speaking majority co-funds some of the public TV and radio in the minority regions. That's apart and entirely separate from the normal fiscal equalization, which I'll talk about in a minute. Parties, here I plotted the effective number of parties in the lower chamber over the decades. So effective number of parties is just a sophisticated way of counting the number of parties because they're weighted by their actual size, but basically it's how many parties are there in the lower chambers of these four countries. Just for the sake of illustration, you see that in red, Switzerland has remained stable. There are still 5 parties today as there were in 1940. Whereas in Belgium, obviously you have experienced this yourself, an explosion in the number of parties and a similar stability in Canada and Spain to some extent. All this just to highlight you that the party system, again, cuts across the linguistic divides. Why? Because what matters for the parties is, again, the cantons. I'm sorry to, again, fall back on the cantons, but the different parties have the different strongholds in the different cantons, and they do not overlap with language. So here, just again, for the sake of illustration, which party was strongest at the last federal election? You see the sea of green, that's the Conservative Party. Okay, they're a bit stronger in the German-speaking area, but you also have areas of German-speaking Switzerland where the Christian Democrats are strong, or the New Centrist Party, or even the Socialists here in Basel City. Whereas in the French-speaking part, again, you have areas where Christian Democrats are strong, or where socialists are strong, or liberals. So the different parties, all the major parties compete throughout Switzerland. So the party system is not split, and they all win something in the different areas of Switzerland. Fiscal equalization. So who are the rich cantons and who are the poor ones? Again, it cuts across the linguistic divide. So in orange, the more orange, the richer. So this is how much broken down on a per capita level, how much is transferred, or if you want, how much is taken out of the pockets of an individual citizen residing in each canton every year and transferred to the others. So positive figures mean that money is taken away from individual citizens, whereas negative figures, the darker the violet, the more the citizens get. So you see that the richest canton, Canton of Zug, citizens pay the equivalent of 1,200 francs, which is about the same as euro at the moment, every year, to the poorer cantons. Now, who are the poorer cantons? We find poorer cantons both on the French-speaking side, Jura, French-speaking, Neuchâtel, French-speaking, and on the German-speaking side, Uri, German-speaking, Glarus, German-speaking. So it's not that the richer German-speaking parts subsidize the poorer French-speaking part, or the other way around, but the money goes across linguistic divide. Swiss fiscal equalization at the moment has the official target of 86.5% of the cantonal mean. So every canton should receive exactly 86.5% of the cantonal mean in terms of endowment with resources. So it's not 100%. Swiss solidarity stops at 86.5%. Okay, so that was all just a brief background and overview of the overall system of Switzerland. Now let's talk about federalism. So I have 3 points that I'll talk about that I think work well. Horizontal collaboration, so the different cantons cooperate with each other. The influence of the cantons, or what is called cantonal lobbying, and linguistic peace, or the accommodation of linguistic minorities. And there are 3 points that are in a way mirror images of these positive aspects. So the vertical division of labor is not so great, could be better, especially the smaller units, the smaller cantons have problems of state capacity, as for instance, the pandemic has shown. And then there is the eternal debate of how much unity, how much diversity should a system such as Switzerland have. So what works well from a point of view of policymaking is that because these 26 cantons are completely autonomous in how they solve their public tasks, so how they deliver care to the elderly, or how they engage in university education, or how they organize security and prisons on their territory. So these are the typical areas of the Swiss cantons: health, social affairs, and justice and security. So the courts and the police and the prisons, they're all at the cantonal level. How they do that? They can engage in treaties. So you see that by the last count, there are over 600 treaties in force between the different cantons, either between just 2 and 3 cantons or between a group of cantons, but there are also what is called the omnilateral, so treaties that cover all 26 cantons to solve public policy without that having to go to the federal level. So that's policy making done at the subnational level, but by all the cantons together, funded by them, decided by them, completely autonomous. Now the question is that still democratic? There are some scholars that say, why do we have this 4th level, intermediate level between the confederation, the federal level, and the cantonal? So this trans-cantonal area. Consensus or a majority of people still think it's democratic because these are treaties negotiated by the cantonal executive, which are popularly elected, directly elected, approved by the cantonal parliaments, which are again directly elected. And some of these treaties are even subject to a direct democratic challenge. So they can be challenged. And if they pass the hurdle of a popular vote, they have the additional legitimacy of direct popular consent. So it's not that some backdoor negotiation takes place, or if it takes place, at the end of the day, it is still approved, or at least not challenged by the people in the different cantons and by the different MPs. What does not work so well, and here I come back to what I said in the beginning, the evolution of Switzerland has been towards more and more centralization, the exact opposite, if you will, of Belgium. So in 1848, when the Swiss Federation was founded, 1 means perfect centralization. Everything is decided, implemented at the federal, national level. 7 means everything is decided at the cantonal level. So you see over time, all 3 lines. So the red line means how many laws of all the laws in all the policy areas, how many laws, how much is decided at the central level, at the national level. The blue means how much of all the implementation is done at the canton level, and the finances is where is the money raised and spent. So these are summary indices that should trace the overall evolution. So you see that there has been a centralization in all 3 domains, but the starkest centralization has taken place in terms of policy making, so the laws. So more and more laws are decided at the national level, but the implementation, so who implements, who applies those laws, is still predominantly in cantonal hands. So you might have a new law on biometric passports. What is part of it, how much security should go into it, who stores all the data, but the whole implementation, the office where you go to apply for a new passport, although it's a Swiss passport, it's a cantonal office or even a local office in some of the big cities, and so on and so forth. So the federal level decides, but the cantonal level implements. That's what is called German system of federalism, administrative federalism. That's also why the money is still predominantly at the lower level, because making laws does not cost you anything. We could make a new law now for the whole world and it would not cost us anything. But it's the implementation, the control, the checks, the receiving applications, approving them, controlling that the money is used as advertised. It's the application, the implementation that costs, because there are people involved in policing the decisions. So why is that bad? Because it's bad because this principle of fiscal equivalence. So in German we say, wer zahlt befiehlt, he who pays should also decide what is done is disrupted, because you have one level making the decisions, the federal level, MPs elected at the national level, they make a new law, but it's the lower level that has to apply and pay for the application of that law. Now, initially, that principle was more or less adhered to simply because it was not so centralized. Now, over time, we have what they say is a relatively bad aspect of Swiss federalism, the gap between decisions and finance. And I'm happy to talk more about that later on if that is what interests you. Now, what is good, as I said, we have moved towards the German model of federalism, but without what we all know, the model of federal influence, the Bundesrat, the German Bundesrat, the German Senate, where the regional executives are directly represented in Berlin at the federal level. The Swiss Senate, as I explained you earlier, is elected by the people, and the MPs are not bound to vote or behave as their cantonal government instructs them. In fact, it's forbidden for MPs to receive instructions from anybody, even their canton of where they were elected. So we have this movement of power to the center, but the cantonal voice is not formally guaranteed. So the cantons have found ways to informally be heard at the national level. So whenever a new law gets prepared at the federal level, what in Switzerland is very important is the so-called consultation phase. So before even the law enters parliament and is debated by the committees and the two chambers, there is a consultation phase. So the draft law is sent to the parties, to economic associations, and to all the cantons and communal governments. And they get to have a say of what they think works or does not work. Doesn't mean that their point of view is taken into consideration, but it's just another option to be heard and to have their interests be taken on board. There are also regular dialogues, especially between the executives. So the federal executive, twice a year, they meet with a delegation of the cantonal executive. It's called the Federalist Dialogue. Personal careers go also in both directions. So you have members of cantonal executives that become national MPs and become national ministers, or you also have national senators or MPs that become regional executive members. And Switzerland being small, everybody knows everybody. So that's yet another way of how the informal influence of the lower level can work at the federal level. Cantons also lobby themselves. So they have embassies in Bern, in the capital. So like some of the regions or nations, I should say, of Europe have embassies in Brussels. The Swiss cantons also have some mini embassies in the federal capital to observe and interact with national MPs. And then finally, the last instrument that the cantons can use to be heard at the national level is direct democracy. So you probably know that 50,000 citizens can challenge any act of parliament. 8 cantons can also do that. So ever since 1874, at least 8 cantons within 100 days of the publication of the act of the federal parliament, they can challenge that act and demand a popular vote across Switzerland. Now the canton, and that's called the Cantona Referendum. The cantons have used that instrument only once so far in 2003, but they've used it successfully. And sometimes it's enough to use an instrument once, but successfully, because ever since 2003, the cantonal perspective is taken even more on board, because there is this threat: if you don't listen to us, we'll use the referendum and we'll defeat the law in a popular vote. So again, that has strengthened the veto position of cantons, which again strengthens the status quo. So it's another reason why the evolution of Switzerland has been very slow. Maybe I should say how slow is slow. So as you probably know, women got the right to vote in Switzerland only in 1971. So we just celebrated 50 years, celebrated 50 years of the female right to vote. Maternity cover, maternity leave has been introduced only in 2004, and paternity leave, so fathers are entitled to 2 weeks of paid leave only since 2 months ago. So that's what's so slow in Swiss policymaking, because it's so difficult to change policy at the federal level. And what is absent from that list are political parties. So political parties, unlike, as I heard from my colleagues that work in Belgium, where they are very important, in Switzerland, they don't really matter. Why? Because you have the same parties present in coalitions. So you have coalitions everywhere. And the division of labor applies to the parties too. So the federal branch of the party takes care of the federal affairs, tries to win federal elections and federal referendums, whereas the cantonal branches take care of cantonal politics. They try to win cantonal elections and cantonal referendums. Of course, they talk to each other, but there is no bottom-up or top-down communications within the parties. Again, the question here can be said, is this still democratic that these cantons, some of which are very small, some of which are very big, have so much influence? It's not democratic if you say one person should have one vote, but it is democratic if you say that democracy means working together and coming to a consensus that is good enough for almost everybody, because the cantonal perspective contributes to better policymaking, contributes to a greater satisfaction of more people, because they map onto different interests. You have poor cantons, rich cantons, cantons that are very active in the chemical industry. You have cantons active in tourism. So it's important to invest in tourism or to invest in that, etc., etc. So the different interests are taken on board, thanks also to the cantonal influence. But again, it's a point for debate, and not even Swiss scholars are entirely in agreement of whether that's good or bad. What I just described is cantonal lobbying. Because some of the cantons are really very small. And what does it mean, very small? So here you see the size, so the population size of the different cantons. The largest canton has 1.5 million inhabitants, Canton of Zurich. But you see there are 8 cantons that have less than 100,000 inhabitants. Now, I don't know the different cities of Belgium so well, but I imagine that's a neighborhood, or not even a neighborhood, of some of the largest cities that you have in Belgium. And yet all these 8 cantons with less than 100,000 inhabitants, sorry, there's a zero too much, 100,000 it should be, all these cantons have exactly the same rights and obligations as the larger cantons. So they have to have a police, they have a constitution, they have prisons. None of them has a university, but they all have high schools that is supposed to prepare people to go to university. They have dual education systems. They have to take care of health and pay subsidies for environment. They had to apply the measures, and during the pandemic, they had to administer the vaccinations. And you can imagine a canton with just 15,000 inhabitants to start a contact tracing system and have a plan for vaccinations for all its population. It's much harder than for a huge canton with a very professional bureaucracy, with a lot of experts and well-paid people that work for that canton. And yet, here we are. So we have this diversity of breads, if you want. Some breads are very big and very powerful, and some are very small. But for the moment, every tentative to merge the different units has failed. Finally, so the last positive point, and then I'll slowly conclude, is that although there are 4 languages, or 2 major languages, if you want, German and French, German majority, French largest minority, the linguistic cleavage has never been a major issue. So Switzerland has never been threatened with the breakup because of language. And yet this cleavage has always been there, either directly, because, for instance, in the First World War, French speakers were much more sympathetic to one side, whereas German speakers were much more sympathetic to the other, the German side. So this cleavage has always been there. There are differences related to political culture. So French speakers are less hesitant to call for state intervention. German speakers are more hesitant, so they give preference to personal freedom and the small role of the state. But these are not major issues because for several reasons. So all the political parties are themselves federations and are present in the different regions. But the second point especially, so all the languages are regionally dominant. And because the subnational level is so much more important at the moment than the federal level, not judging from the media. So the media give a lot more attention to the federal level. But actually, if you look at how much money is spent and raised, it's the cantonal level, it's the intermediate, it's the bread that really matters. And it's here that the different languages are dominant. And at the same time, the languages are divided. So there are different cantons where French is the dominant language. So there is never just one actor speaking for all the French speakers. In fact, the jealousies between the French-speaking canton is probably greater than the problems between German and French-speaking cantons. At the federal level, the rule applied to accommodate linguistic minorities is what I would call proportionality plus. So it's not just that the different groups are proportionally represented, but on the one hand, there is some flexibility, and on the other, there is also an expectation, at least at the federal level, that you understand one, if not two, other national languages. So everybody gets to speak their national language, but you can expect that they understand your language, but they will reply to you in their own. So you would have a committee meeting with 2 French speakers, 1 Italian speaker and 5 German speaker, and each member would be able to speak their own language, and the other one would be able to reply in their own mother tongue. So it's not a hard rule. It's not written anywhere that this should be the case, but this has been practiced for 170 years. So de facto, it became a rule that you should have very good passive knowledge of at least 2 other languages. In the Senate, for instance, so in the Swiss Senate, debates take place without simultaneous translation. Obviously, for an Italian speaker, it's clear that not everybody understands Italian. So the saying goes that if an Italian-speaking member of parliament speaks to his own electorate at home, he or she will speak Italian. If he or she wants to be heard by the others, he or she will speak French. And if he or she wants to win a debate, they will speak German, because German is still the majority language in all the committees and party caucuses. And as I said before, the party ideologies and the other cleavages, they cut across each other. So you have German-speaking Catholic regions, you have German-speaking Protestant regions, and the same on the French side. You have wealthy German-speaking areas, such as Zug in the center that pays the most, but you also have wealthy French-speaking areas, such as Geneva, that also pays a lot to the other cantons, both German and French-speaking. And here, the criticism that can be leveled against this situation, this linguistic peace, is that it works mainly because the different groups live next to each other. So they all have their little cantons where they can do whatever they want, more or less, but they don't really live together. Even at the national level, the different people can speak their own language and understand the other, but they don't really join together in one linguistic unity or in one even a national unity, because they have so much at their own subnational level. But maybe that's just the price to pay for having linguistic peace. And then, okay, the last point here on the negative side, since we are with unity and diversity, as in every other federation or non-federation, it's always a question of how much to centralize, and especially through what method. So should the federal government just overtake? Again, it's interesting to look at the pandemic. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit Switzerland in February 2 years ago, the federal government, so the federal executive, just decided for the whole country, and we had overnight centralization. And then in the second wave and the third wave, they decided to relax. So the federal government decided, but the lower levels were involved and somehow heard. So the standard administrative federalism. The other option is you can have a uniform body of law through the treaties. So you can make a treaty, for instance, on the joint school curriculum. So primary schools are the regional cantonal domain par excellence. Each canton decides fully autonomously what the kids learn in school, when they learn it. So when are the holidays, how many hours per week, and how many years they have to go to school for the primary school, when do they start, etc., etc. Everything is fully autonomous, but the different cantons within the language regions have decided to harmonize their school curricula. So at the moment, there are 3 primary school curricula. There's the Plan d'études roman, so the French-speaking school curriculum. There is a German-speaking school curriculum, and there is an Italian-speaking school curriculum. But again, these curricula have been decided, elaborated by delegates from the different cantons over 10 years. So it takes time, and it might not be the most efficient solution in the short term. There have been a lot of challenges against this harmonization. Each challenge was rejected. So we have those school plans now in place. And the idea is that it is now more efficient for everybody after 10 years of elaboration. It's also mainly a left-right debate, which is bad news because it fuels polarization. So for the left, things such as climate change or LGBT rights, they should just be decided at the central level, once and for all, the same for everybody, whereas the political right is a lot more in favor of regional autonomy and letting the different areas decide for their own. If some want to go faster, they can do that. If some want to lag behind, they can also do that. So going back to the female right to vote, at federal level, it was introduced in 1971, but some cantons were actually had to be forced by the federal tribunal, by the Supreme Court, to give their women the right to vote in cantonal affairs as late as 1991. So that's also what federalism means. If the different areas are so autonomous, they can decide not to decide and just stay the way they were 400, 500, 600 years ago. Obviously, one of the main issues is money. So there is a fiscal equalization system that transfers from the richer to the poorer cantons, but actually most of the money is from the federal government. So 60% of that total fiscal equalization comes from the federal government, and only 40% are horizontal transfers from the richer to the poorer cantons. Tax competition, the final point, because most of the direct tax, by far the most of direct taxes, is paid at the canton level. So every year, citizens have to fill in their tax declaration, and you get a provisional breakdown of how much you have to pay. 90% of what you pay, depending on the income bracket, 90% of what you pay goes to the canton and the municipality, and only 10% of your total tax bill goes to the federal level. And even from that 10%, 21% can be kept by the canton. So it's the cantonal fiscal administration that administer it. So I get invited by the cantonal tax authorities to submit my declaration. Then I get the bill from the cantonal tax administration. They keep their share, and they also keep 21.2% of the federal income tax because, as we said before, the administration, so the heavy lifting, the heavy work is done at the subnational level and not at the federal level. Okay, so let's conclude. So Swiss federalism is really the result of a long historical process that goes back to the Middle Ages, when the first cantons started to cooperate to protect against the evil Habsburgs or the French or all the other empires that were growing around Switzerland. But still today, it is mainly a bottom-up affair. So federal competences need the approval of a majority of people and of cantons. And the cantons are permanently involved in negotiating with the federal level, but also with each other, which has the consequence that it's very slow in changing. It's important to remember that it's the 26 cantons and not the 4 language regions that are the building blocks. So Switzerland has 4 languages, but they're not officially recognized. They don't exist really on paper, except maybe for public TV and radio. And even there, it's just to deliver public TV and radio. Federalism has been weakened by direct democracy, because direct democracy, popular votes, the Swiss vote all the time. Every 4 months, there is a referendum on something. That strengthens the unity, so the cantonal level becomes less important. But at the same time, you have popular votes also within the canton, so that again strengthens this cantonal level of the overall system. Federalism is compatible with the idea of power sharing. So federalism means that the 26 cantons come together and join for the delivery of certain public tasks. The army, diplomacy, foreign relations, there are no cantonal embassies outside of Switzerland. There is only Swiss embassies, but other things are kept fully within the autonomy of the regional levels. And the cantons can also work together to maintain their language, or for instance, in the school domain, as I said, develop a common curriculum. So finally, I'm sorry to say that Switzerland may be not such a good source of inspiration, because the development has been completely opposite of Belgium. So whereas the saying of hollowing out of the state has been applied to Belgium by scholars working on those things, in Switzerland it was actually the opposite. It's a slow filling up of the federal level, a slow giving more power, especially legislative powers, to the federal level. Who knows, maybe in a couple of years or decades, we will meet somewhere in the middle. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Hartelijk bedankt, meneer de professor. Ik stel voor dat alle partijen met een beurtrol die we kennen hun vragen stellen en dat ik dan bij u terugkom voor uw antwoorden. Als dat oké is voor u, ik neem aan van wel. We starten vandaag met groen, dus collega Van Eekhuiz, aan u de eer.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter. Eerst en vooral onze dank aan de professor Muller voor de toelichting en de zeer interessante kennismaking, voor zover het nog nodig was, met het systeem, het staatskundig systeem in Zwitserland. Ik denk dat de slotconclusie natuurlijk ons zou kunnen concluderen van we gaan geen vragen meer stellen, want we hebben niet veel te leren, maar toch is er iets die mij triggert. Ik vond het zeer boeiend en ik denk dat er toch wel wat inspiratie te halen valt over de dynamiek van landen en van regio's, in jullie geval kantons. Maar wat mij eigenlijk het meest triggerde was de evolutie over de lange termijn. En de slide die u presenteerde omtrent de evolutie sinds ongeveer 1850 tot op vandaag, 2010, en de evolutie die daar plaatsvindt. We zien daar toch eigenlijk, als het gaat over zowel implementatie en nog sterker als het gaat over de wetgevende macht, dat heel wat zaken richting de federale overheid of het federale niveau verschuiven. Wat mij het meest boeit op dit moment, of wat mij nog meest triggert als vraag, is enerzijds, wat zijn daar de belangrijkste drijfveren van? Zijn die goed onderzocht en kan u die een stuk meer uitleggen nog hoe het komt dat doorheen die 150, 160 jaar blijkbaar toch de noodzaak is gevoeld om heel wat zaken toch meer op een federaal niveau, zeker wetgevend, maar ook ten dele wat betreft implementatie te gaan invullen. En twee, nu liep de grafiek tot 2010. Wat mij ook interesseert is, ziet u diezelfde evolutie de voorbije 10 jaar, maar is daar eigenlijk ook een aanvoelen over dat dit ook de komende 20, 30 jaar in dezelfde richting zal verder gaan in de context van de wereld waarin we vandaag leven? Dank u wel.
Dank u wel, collega Van Eekhuiz. Dan is het woord aan de N-VA-fractie, collega Van Lauwen, neem ik aan.
Ja, inderdaad, mevrouw de voorzitter. Ik neem aan dat de professor ons toch nog volgt?
Daarnet wel, nu dat weet ik niet meer.
Goed. Ja.
Nee, hij ziet ons. Ja.
Ja. Perfect. Maar ik zag hem niet meer op het scherm en ik dacht hij is toch niet uitgelogd of zo, maar het is in orde dus.
Na Jeremie wel.
Ja.
Nee, collega Van Leeuwen.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter. Ik dank ook zeer hartelijk de professor. Ik vond het zeer boeiend. Er zijn uiteraard enorme verschillen, maar er zijn anderzijds ook wel gelijkenissen met ons federale land. Wat mij vooral interessant leek, is eigenlijk die bottom-up approach. Het land is natuurlijk zo opgebouwd, historisch. Kantons die autonomie hadden, die uiteindelijk beslist hebben om te gaan samenwerken. Er is ook een gelijkenis in verband met de taalverschillen. We zijn een land met 3 talen, het is een land met 4 talen. Bij ons vallen die talen natuurlijk grotendeels wel samen met de indeling in gewesten, gemeenschappen dan iets anders. Bij ons is enkel Brussel tweetalig en hebben we natuurlijk in de randgemeente van Vlaams-Brabant en hier en daar aan de taalgrens ook wel wat uitzonderingen met die faciliteiten, jammer genoeg. Nu, mijn vraag is dan ook in de eerste plaats, in hoeverre is extra bescherming van een taalkundige minderheid nodig in dat systeem in Zwitserland? En wij zien natuurlijk ook wel verschillen tussen die 26 kantons, gaande van bijzonder grote Bern, Zurich, 1,5 miljoen inwoners, tot kleinere kantons, ik dacht Uru of zo, van een paar tienduizenden inwoners. Is daar ook een soort van dus bescherming voor die taalkundige minderheden? Of is er ook een soort van bescherming voor die kleinere kantons? Gewoon voor de professor bij ons. Onze grondwet en onze bijzondere wetten zitten vol met een reeks van blokkeringssystemen die eigenlijk een soort van extra bescherming geven aan minderheden. Die zorgen soms ook wel voor de nodige blokkering wanneer er geen overleg of akkoord kan bereikt worden. Verder is het duidelijk dat de macht in Zwitserland om vele redenen erg gedeeld is tussen dat centraal gezag en de kantons, ook tussen partijen. En zijn er dan ook mechanismen eigenlijk ingebouwd om blokkeringen en een gebrek aan akkoord te doorbreken? En zorgt dat dan ook voor daadkrachtige beslissingen? Ik heb er zelf ook wat onderzoek, maar uw toelichting was bijzonder verhelderend. Als ik het goed voor heb, hebben we dus 7 ministers, 7 administraties op dat federale niveau. Maar de 7, dat wil natuurlijk zeggen dat niet ieder kanton vertegenwoordigd is op dat federale niveau. Ik hoorde wel dat de talen wel, of toch 3 talen, telkens vertegenwoordigd zijn. Bij ons zitten we met systemen dat toch wel de 2 grote taalgroepen, dat daar een pariteit moet zijn tussen die niveaus. Verder stel ik mij de vraag, er is een grondwet voor dat hele Zwitserse confederaal land. Worden deelstaten, worden de kantons betrokken bijvoorbeeld bij grondwetsherzieningen? Of is dat iets dat eigenlijk door dat federale niveau beslist zou worden? Verder had ik nog een vraag hoe het federale niveau al dan niet ingrijpt op het kantonale niveau. U hebt gezegd bij de corona-epidemie dat eigenlijk er een enorme centralisering was tijdens de eerste en de tweede golf. En nadien was er wel meer betrokkenheid van de kantons. Terwijl we in het begin ook zeiden van de bevoegdheid ligt toch wel op het vlak van gezondheidszorg op dat kantonale niveau. Is er dus ergens een soort van federale scheidsrechter, om het zo te zeggen? Kan die ingrijpen? Moet die ingrijpen? En is er ook een soort van grondwettelijk hof bij bevoegdheids- en belangenconflicten? Verder had ik ook nog een vraag. Er zijn, als ik het goed voor heb, toegewezen bevoegdheden voor het federale niveau. Men heeft die 7 departementen. Er zijn ook toegewezen bevoegdheden voor de verschillende kantons. En natuurlijk zijn er bevoegdheden die niet in de wet staan, in de grondwet staan. Klopt het dat die ook aan de kantons, door de kantons worden uitgeoefend? Dat is een discussie die bij ons toch wel leeft. Het beruchte artikel 35 zegt bij ons dat dus de niet toegewezen bevoegdheden toebehoren aan de deelstaten, maar in de realiteit is het zo dat dit artikel niet wordt uitgevoerd. Bestaat ook zo een discussie binnen het Zwitserse systeem? U ziet eigenlijk ook de wil om samen te blijven als een kenmerk van federalisme. En hoe kan u eigenlijk die eenheid omschrijven? Want op het einde hoorde ik u toch wel zeggen, ieder is toch nog wel wat betrokken, vooral binnen zijn eigen kanton of binnen zijn eigen taalkundige groep. mijn beperkte ervaring met Zwitserland. Ik herinner mij het kanton Wallis, een tweetalig kanton. Maar als ik het goed door heb, sprak men daar toch wel degelijk over een Franstalig gedeelte binnen het kanton en het Duitsstalig gedeelte. Ik had niet de indruk dat dat kanton echt tweetalig was. Is er ook een soort overheid die bevoegd is voor de taalwetgeving? Iets wat heel belangrijk is bij ons. We hebben eigenlijk een goede taalwet. Er is één probleem, ze wordt niet nageleefd. Toch niet in Brussel, waar die tweetaligheid zou moeten gegarandeerd worden. En dan had ik nog een laatste vraag. Kantons hebben dus constitutieve autonomie. Bij ons ook de deelstaten Vlaanderen en Wallonië hebben ook constitutieve autonomie. Betekent dit dan ook dat de modaliteiten van de verkiezingen van de leden van, wat u zei, de Senaat, dus ja, de Eerste of Tweede Kamer, maar de vertegenwoordiging vanuit de kantons, verschilt van kanton tot kanton? Tot daar, mevrouw de voorzitter, de vragen die ik wens stellen, maar ik heb ook 2 collega's in mijn fractie die ook nog vragen hebben. Want het is zo interessant dat we hierover
Alsof ik die nog niet had zien zitten. Collega Koen.
Ja, dank u, voorzitter. 2 korte thema's. 1, wat betreft die samenwerkingsakkoorden. Ik begrijp uit uw uitleg dat er daar zeer veel van zijn, dat die soms tussen een aantal kantons zijn of tussen 2 kantons, maar in een beperkt aantal gevallen zelfs tussen alle 26 kantons. Als er structureel via samenwerkingsakkoorden op het niveau van de 26 kantons wordt gewerkt, leidt dat dan ook tot een debat om de bevoegdheden waar die samenwerkingsakkoorden rond gaan, om die dan eventueel terug toe te wijzen aan het federale niveau. En wat zijn daar de argumenten voor en tegen? Wat is uw oordeel? Wat werkt best? Het via samenwerkingsakkoorden doen of het op federaal niveau houden? En dan, of het terug op federaal niveau brengen? En dan omtrent de fiscaliteit. Ik begrijp uit uw uitleg dat de belastingen grotendeels vanuit de kantons worden geïnd en dan doorgestort. En dat bij die doorstorting zelfs al een afhouding is van een stukje van het federale niveau. Hier in België is het grotendeels andersom. Is het vooral de federale staat en wordt er dan gewerkt met dotaties. Kan u daar misschien duiden naar responsabilisering, welk systeem uw voorkeur wegdraagt? En hier in België is het ook een belangrijk discussiepunt dat de interpersoonlijke solidariteit binnen de sociale zekerheid, dat die toch vooral op federaal niveau moet blijven en dat daar ook de nodige financiële middelen moeten tegenover staan. Hoe is dat in het Zwitsers model geregeld? Kan u dat toelichten? Dank u.
Collega Klaas.
Ja, ik wil alvast de professor danken voor zijn zeer boeiende uiteenzetting. Ik heb nog 5 korte puntjes die ik zou willen aanhalen. Professor, u bent zo net ingegaan met betrekking tot de openbare omroep in Zwitserland. Hè. En het is ook opmerkelijk, de Zwitserse radio- en televisiemaatschappij, dat valt onder het federaal niveau. En de 4 regionale omroepen, die worden dan ook gefinancierd. Hè. In België wordt dit bij uitstek cultuurgebonden, taalgebonden en persoonsgebonden als dit soort bevoegdheid gezien. En mijn vraag is dan ook, hoe is dit model eigenlijk van financiering in Zwitserland gegroeid of zo georganiseerd? Ik weet, u heeft dat kort aangehaald, maar kan daar eventueel nog wat dieper op ingegaan worden en wat meer toelichting over gegeven worden? Een tweede vraag die had ik over justitie. Dat is nu niet echt concreet toegelicht, maar ik had begrepen dat justitie ook grotendeels een kantonale bevoegdheid is. Mijn vraag was dan ook, wat zijn de voordelen van deze aanpak, de risico's of eventuele uitdagingen bij jullie? Nu, de COVID-pandemie, elk land en elke regio heeft daarmee te maken gehad. Voor veel landen was het ook een soort van stresstest, waarbij de sterkte van de instellingen ook naar boven kwam. En bij ons was er heel veel onduidelijkheid, heel veel discussie wie welke bevoegdheid had. En u zei zo net, in die eerste golf en in die tweede golf werden de beslissingen vooral op federaal niveau genomen. Tijdens de derde golf werden de lagere of de kleinere niveaus betrokken. Hè. En u zei dan ook van die contacttracing, het vaccineren, dat er heel veel verschillen waren tussen die 26 kantons. En de vraag is dan eigenlijk ook, ja, hoe hebben jullie dan die coronapandemie en die aanpak ervaren? Evalueren jullie dat positief? Waren er ook moeilijkheden, net zoals bij ons? Of hoe is dat eigenlijk in zijn verloop gegaan? Een andere kleine vraag. Ja, de kantons hebben ook een grote mate van constitutionele autonomie. Wat als die wetten, die kantonale grondwetten, botsen met de federale grondwet? Valt dat voor en hoe wordt dat dan in de praktijk aangepakt? En tenslotte, in de presentatie zeg ik ook, ja, er is een groot verschil tussen de 26 kantons in termen van grootte, bevolkingsaantallen, ook de talen. Sommige kantons zijn 2- of zelfs 3-talig en de meeste eentalig. Toch is de institutionele bevoegdheidsverdeling helemaal symmetrisch. En mijn laatste vraag is dan ook, ja, wat is de reden waarom eigenlijk? Dank u wel voor de antwoorden.
Dank u wel, collega Klaas. Dan geef ik graag nu het woord aan collega Slootmans.
Ja, dank u, voorzitter. Ook dank aan professor Muller voor de kwaliteit van zijn uiteenzetting. Nu, Zwitserland is natuurlijk inderdaad een zeer dankbaar voorbeeld voor elk debat over federalisme of over confederalisme. We herinneren ons allemaal hoe de voorzitter van de Vlaamse Christen-Democraten bij ons onlangs pleitte om van België eigenlijk het Zwitserland aan de Noordzee te maken omwille van zijn inderdaad bottom-up approach, hoge mate van subsidiariteit en directe democratie. Nu, het is hier inderdaad al aangehaald. De vraag is of dat Zwitserland, dat toch de laatste jaren, ook gesteld door de professor, meer de neiging heeft naar meer centralisatie, ja, wel te vergelijken valt met België, omdat je bij ons de laatste decennia, sinds 1970, toch eerder een centrifugale dynamiek ziet met een toenemende macht en een autonomie voor de deelstaten. Een cruciaal element daarbij is natuurlijk ook het feit dat nationale partijen bij ons niet meer bestaan, in tegenstelling tot in Zwitserland. Dus de vraag naar vergelijkbaarheid is mijn eerste vraag. En daarop verdergaand stelde u in de slides, maar ik denk niet dat u er in uw uiteenzetting, toch niet zoals ik gehoord heb, op bent ingegaan, stelt u dat de transferdiscussie tussen de verschillende kantons voornamelijk ook een rechts-links verhaal is. Kan u daar wat meer toelichting bij geven? Want wat dat betreft zijn er wellicht vergelijkingspunten. In Vlaanderen of in België is dat ook voor een groot stuk een rechts-links verhaal, wat dan weer contrasteert met bijvoorbeeld wat je ziet in Spanje met Baskeland en Catalonië, waar die transferdiscussie eigenlijk vooral een links-rechts verhaal is, waarbij de Basken en de Catalonen eigenlijk die vraag naar meer fiscale autonomie en macht over eigen middelen daar de vraag toe hebben. Dan een vraag wat de grondwetsherziening betreft. Ja, bij ons is er inderdaad een zeer rigide systeem waarbij je dus een dubbele gekwalificeerde meerderheid nodig hebt en waarbij je in 2 stappen werkt, met in de eerste fase een preconstituante, vervolgens een ontbinding van het parlement, om vervolgens een nieuwe constituante te verkiezen, die dan eventueel aan de slag gaat met die grondwetsherziening. Enfin, een zeer stroeve en starre manier van werken die tot gevolg heeft dat breed gedragen herzieningseisen toch worden geblokkeerd door een minderheid en vaak dan een taalminderheid. Nu, aangezien de staatsrichting gerelateerd is aan de grondwet, evident, is het natuurlijk daardoor heel moeilijk om dit land structureel te gaan hervormen. En mijn vraag is dan ook eerder een van appreciatie als federalisme-expert. Vindt u dat een dergelijk gekwalificeerd meerderheidssysteem vanuit democratisch oogpunt nog te verdedigen valt? En welk advies zou u daarbij geven vanuit uw expertise om deze te wijzigen? En daarop verder bordurend, een vraag die mij nog niet helemaal duidelijk is. U bent erop ingegaan in het kader van die lobbying. Kan een taalgroep in Zwitserland op federaal niveau beslissingen tegenhouden die door middel van speciaal meerderheidssystemen of alarmbelprocedures worden opgezegd, zoals dat bij ons het geval is. Dan nog een korte vraag, gerelateerd aan de lezing die we hier onlangs hadden van professor Spolare, u wellicht niet onbekend. Die stelde eigenlijk zeer kort samengevat dat de schaalvoordelen van een unitair federaal beleid telkens moeten worden afgewogen tegen de heterogeniteitskosten als gevolg van tegengestelde of verschillende visies of voorkeuren van de verschillende deelstaten. Nu, het hebben van een verschillende taal, wat dat in Zwitserland en in België natuurlijk het geval is daarbij volgens professor Spolare een van de factoren die een dergelijke heterogeniteitskost sterk fors doen toenemen. Nu, in België klinkt dat uiteraard zeer bekend in de oren. Mijn vraag aan u als Zwitser en als professor federalisme is dan ook welke institutionele conclusies er volgens u moeten worden getrokken wanneer die heterogeniteitskost inderdaad steeds hoger wordt dan het schaalvoordeel en vooral wanneer je objectief kan bepalen wanneer je dat breekpunt hebt bereikt waarbij apart doorgaan eigenlijk opportuner of beter is dan samen verplicht in een keurslijf te worden gestopt. En u weet dat wellicht niet, maar ik praat hier vanuit een Vlaams-nationale insteek. Ik behoor tot een Vlaams-nationale partij met de evidente autonomie eisen die daarmee gepaard gaan. Dan nog een vraag waar meneer Van Lauwe ook al kort op alludeerde. Het is een ook misschien eerder informatieve vraag. Als inwoner van de Vlaamse rand, dus kort tegen Brussel, ik woon in een regio met verschillende gemeenten waar taalfaciliteiten gelden voor Franstaligen. Dus binnen het Vlaams gewest kunnen Franstaligen in die gemeente administratieve stukken in hun eigen taal gaan aanvragen, waardoor je feitelijk de territoriale integriteit van het Vlaams gewest, van Vlaanderen, ondergraaft. En het gevolg daarvan is geweest dat die gemeenten natuurlijk in de afgelopen decennia als een echte magneet hebben gewerkt op Franstaligen en Nederlandstaligen daar vandaag de facto eigenlijk een marginale minderheid zijn geworden. Maar dat is een gewoon neveneffect. En als ik mij niet vergis, heeft onze commissievoorzitter daar in een niet zo ver verleden meer dan eens mee te maken gehad. Nu, wat ik mij daarbij afvraag, is of er in de Zwitserse kantons, waar telkens een welbepaalde taal overheerst, ook faciliteiten bestaan voor anderstaligen, zoals in de rand- en taalgrensgemeenten bij ons, en vooral welke uw appreciatie daarvan is. Dan nog een korte vraag over de regeringsvorming. Een ander wezenlijk verschil ook met België lijkt mij de manier hoe regeringen worden gevormd. Zoals u weet halen wij daar bij elke verkiezing wereldrecords. Bij jullie zit daar duidelijk een tijdslimiet op, waarbij er na een bepaalde tijd a priori eigenlijk een afspiegelingsregering wordt gevormd van de taalgemeenschappen. In België wordt er met dat idee ook gespeeld. Staat volgens mij ook in het federaal regeerakkoord. Dus het lijkt me wel interessant te weten hoe u dat opgelegde systeem van die verplichte regeringsvorming evalueert en of u het ons al dan niet aanbeveelt. Tot daar.
Dank u wel, collega Slootmans. En dan tenslotte collega Van Rompuy.
Ja, dank u, voorzitter. Als ik de uiteenzetting van de professor goed gevolgd heb, is in Zwitserland de macht sterk verspreid, bijna verbrokkeld over kantons, partijen, federaal en dergelijke meer. En ik had daarbij een aantal vragen, want ik heb de indruk dat men in Zwitserland kiest voor wat ik zou noemen een pacificatiemodel, een model dat probeert om zoveel mogelijk kantons, taalgemeenschappen en dergelijke meer aan boord te houden tijdens de politieke besluitvorming. Laat ik beginnen bij het federale niveau, waar het mij zou interesseren om te weten hoe dat de federale regering wordt samengesteld. Ik begrijp dat er een soort van proportionaliteit plus is, maar het is mij toch niet helemaal duidelijk hoe dat juist in zijn werk gaat. Welke partijen in de regering komen, want ik heb gezien dat het zijn nu de christendemocraten, de liberalen, de conservatieven, ik zal ze zo noemen, die in de regering zitten, en de socialisten, maar niet de groenen. Nochtans meen ik gezien te hebben in de slide dat zij de tweede of de derde partij zijn in Zwitserland, maar ze zitten toch niet in de regering. Of dat een wijze beslissing is of niet, dat is een andere zaak, dat laat ik in het midden. Mijn vraag is, hoe gaat dat juist in zijn werk? Als die coalitievorming alsnog louter proportioneel zou gebeuren, is er dan ook sprake van een regeerakkoord in Zwitserland? Want ja, men moet niet met deze of gene onderhandelen. Men is tot elkaar dan veroordeeld, moest het een louter proportioneel systeem zijn. Omdat het interesseert mij om te weten hoe dat men dan tot grote beslissingen moet komen en of dat er dan ook bijvoorbeeld alternatieve meerderheden gevormd worden in Zwitserland. Ik heb gezien dat de conservatieven als enige, denk ik, tegen een resolutie ter veroordeling van de oorlog in Oekraïne gestemd hebben, maar zij maken wel deel uit van de regering. Ik zal niet zeggen de meerderheid in Zwitserland. Dus hoe komt die regeringsvorming tot stand? Dat is toch iets wat mij wel interesseert, hoe dat jullie dat doen. Ten tweede, wat is het belang of de invloed van, hoe zal ik het noemen, de Senaat of de Tweede Kamer in Zwitserland? Is er een echt tweekamerstelsel? Moet een wet in beide kamers een meerderheid halen? Of speelt die Tweede Kamer een marginale rol in het nemen van beslissingen? Ten derde vroeg ik mij af, omdat u die grafiek getoond heeft die wijst op een centralisatie van de besluitvorming. Namelijk, hoe gaat dat dan in zijn werk? Moeten daar ook 2/3 meerderheden gevonden worden tussen de Eerste en de Tweede Kamer om een bevoegdheid van de kantons naar het federale te halen of omgekeerd? Dat proces dat zou mij ook wel interesseren, hoe dat juist in elkaar zit. En ten vierde heeft het mij een beetje verwonderd dat jullie eigenlijk bijna in alle vormen van verkiezingen werken met kantonale kieskringen, zo heb ik het toch begrepen, tenzij wanneer het gaat over referenda. Dan is er wel de mogelijkheid om in heel Zwitserland over één referendum te stemmen. Dat staat een beetje haaks op de kantonale traditie die je in de representatieve democratie terugziet in Zwitserland. Dus bij die referenda vind ik iets bijzonders en ik vroeg mij daar meer specifiek af, als er een bepaalde beslissing genomen wordt, is het parlement of de regering daaraan toe gebonden? Ik geef het voorbeeld, ik denk dat in Zwitserland er een referendum geweest is dat besloten had om een aantal Europese verdragen niet meer te honoreren. Maar ja, ze hebben dat nooit kunnen uitvoeren omdat dat niet onderhandeld geraakte met Europa. Die referenda, ja, eenmaal gestemd, worden die ook uitgevoerd, want daar staat of valt natuurlijk de geloofwaardigheid van dit soort van directe democratie mee, namelijk volgt er ook een resultaat eenmaal men op het knopje geduwd heeft. Dus dat zijn de 4 aspecten waar ik graag wat meer informatie over had gehad. Ik dank u.
Dank u wel. Dan geef ik graag nu het woord aan professor Muller om te antwoorden op de eerste ronde vragen. Professor.
Thank you. I am still here. So is it okay if I take the questions in the order that they came, because that's the list I made?
Yeah, it's fine.
So the first question was on what explains the long-term evolution since 1848 until today in terms of centralization by a member of the Green Party, if I wrote that down correctly. Now, the graph I showed and the research we did was part of a 6-country study. So we did the same thing for 6 classic federations: Canada, US, Germany, Switzerland, Australia, and India. And we saw that, and for each of the country, we tried to track the evolution of centralization since their founding. So 1789 in the US, 1867 in Canada, after the Second World War for India and Germany. And we find a centralization in all the 6 countries except Canada. So the explanation we give is none of the countries decided at some point, now we're going to centralize, but these were slow steps driven mainly by modernization and the integration of society, so single markets, mobility, people moving out and about, and mainly also interest groups pushing for centralization because it was easier for them to have one legal framework applied to the whole country and not, in the Swiss case, 26. So in Switzerland, for instance, after the Second World War, the Association of Lawyers, the Association of Swiss Lawyers, demanded that the civil code be standardized. Until then, you had 26 different civil codes, well, implementation of the civil codes. And so it was associations such as these demanding a uniform solution, not once and for all the sectors, but piecemeal approach. Now, the exception to that trend towards greater centralization is Canada. And Canada has remained, actually, when Canada was founded, it was one of the most centralized federations of those 6. But because it has remained stable and the other countries have centralized, it is now the most decentralized country because of Quebec. So we explain the lack of centralization by the successful resistance of Quebec and other provinces to have centralization. And that factor was absent in Switzerland. There was never a uniform group of French speakers that were against centralization. In fact, French speakers, although a minority, they're often on the side of demanding even greater centralization, even greater state involvement. So we have this paradox in Switzerland that a minority, a linguistic minority, is often demanding greater centralization because of their political culture. And similar things can be said about the other countries. Now, you also asked about after 2010. We have not done the analysis for what has happened since 2010, because the analysis consisted in looking at 22 different policy sectors: agriculture, primary education, and for each policy sectors looking at all the laws and trying to decide what's the extent of rule-making legislation and what's the extent of centralization in application. So it's a lot of work, and we haven't done it. We probably should do, but I would not expect any change. So we have become even more centralized a little bit in the legislative domain and remain stable in administration and fiscal domain. So the trend is the same. The demands for uniform laws across the entire country, at least in Switzerland and the other federations we looked at, is still there. And the cantons, because of their political voice, they are able to keep being important players in terms of application of the laws and in terms of the money that is raised. Then I go to the second batch of questions. So that was about how linguistic minorities are protected. So it depends who you're dealing with. So as a Swiss citizen, if you deal with the federal government, you have the right to address the federal government in any of the actually four national languages. But if you live in a German-speaking canton and you're addressing the canton, it's German. Schools are in German. The same if you live in a French-speaking canton. If you live in Geneva, Geneva is French-speaking. Me, as a German speaker, I do not have the right to send my child to a German-speaking school. There are private schools, but then I have to pay. But public schools is French. All the dealings with authorities, the material, the voting material, the elections, it's all in French. It's the territoriality principle. And in the bilingual cantons, it's the same, but at the local level. So each municipality can autonomously decide its official language or languages. So that's a political process left to the autonomy of the municipalities or of the cantons. So there are actually only 2 or 3 municipalities that are bilingual. So city of Fribourg is, for instance, bilingual, which means you can deal with the local authorities in either French or German. But if you deal with the cantonal authorities, French or German. But if you live in a monolingual canton, it's the language of the majority. There is no special protection for linguistic minorities. You also asked about mechanisms to avoid blockades. So if there is, and that goes to the question that other people had about constitutional amendments. So basically, the federal government can only act if it has a clear constitutional mandate. Now, to change the constitution, there needs to be a popular vote. In that popular vote, a majority of citizens across Switzerland need to agree, and the majority of cantons need to consent to the constitutional amendment. The majority of cantons is calculated by cantonal majorities. So how does the canton of Zurich vote is determined by what the majority in the canton of Zurich is, and so on and so forth for each canton. So the federal government can initiate constitutional change, the parliament can approve constitutional change, but in the end, it's the people and the cantons that have the final word. And so the parliament can recommend not to approve constitutional change, but the people can still do it. Or the parliament can propose a constitutional amendment, but the people can reject it. Or the people can approve it, but the cantonal majorities can reject it. And then in that case, it's rejected. Now, the mechanism, if you want the mechanism to avoid blockade, is to let the people vote. And if the people say no, it's a no. And if the people say yes, it's a yes. So that's the resolution of the blockade. There is no constitutional court. So there is a federal tribunal, but laws, because laws need to be based on constitutional articles, and each law can be challenged. And somebody said, I'll get to the other question. Laws can be challenged, and there is a simple majority to reject or approve a law. The cantons, the constituencies, cantonal constituencies, do not matter for referendums on the laws. They only matter for constitutional articles, which means that once a law is either approved or not rejected, it has to be applied. There is no way to contest a law for non-constitutionality because there is no constitutional court. Or rather, the constitutional court is again the people. They decide and they vote, and if they approve a law, it has to be applied, even if it contradicts the constitution. That's one of the contradictions of the Swiss system. You also mentioned that there are 7 ministers, but 26 cantons. You're right, and that's why, so there are, if you look at all the 26 cantons, there are 5 cantons that never had a federal minister. Whether they will have in the future or not is another question. But at the same time, if you are from one canton and the neighboring canton has a federal minister, it's as if your region is represented. So the rotation is among cantons, but also among linguistic and also macro regions. But you're right, not all the cantons have had representation in the federal government. How the cantons are involved in constitutional review. So this again through the amendment process. Whatever is not defined in the federal constitution as being federal is cantonal. So as I understood, exactly the same as in the Belgian system, residual powers are at the lower level. Just that at the cantonal level, the same principle applies. If the canton of Bern does not have an explicit constitutional mandate to regulate something, it's the municipalities that are competent. So it falls back to the lowest level, which in Switzerland is the municipality. In the pandemic, and how does the federal level intervene at the cantonal level? So the federal level obviously has the legal means to intervene by pressuring cantonal governments to apply the law as the federal level wanted it. And there was a case in the pandemic when the federal government decided to close down the restaurants, but leave the ski resorts in the domain of the cantons. So cantons could decide whether to keep the ski resorts open or not. And that led to the funny situation. What happens to a restaurant in a ski resort? Is it a restaurant? Then it's closed. Or is it part of the ski resort? Then it can stay open if the canton decides that it stays open. And there was a point when the only means available to the federal government was to send the army. So the last resort is for the federal government to send the army into the canton to make it comply with federal regulations. Now, that didn't happen because the governments met and they said, okay, we will apply the law, but give us a week and we will apply it a week later. And that solved the conflict, if you want. But the only other way could have really been to send the army. It was called the War of the White Restaurants. You asked, where does the willingness to cooperate come from? So why do the cantons either cooperate with each other, or why do the cantonal voters agree that the competence is transferred to the federal level? Now, it's also the case that some of these proposals, they fail. So oftentimes a proposal to give more powers to the federal level is rejected, but it's always piecemeal approach. So it's something to do with subsidies for healthcare, or it's something to do with protecting non-smokers by forbidding smoking in restaurants up to from a certain number of square meters onwards. So it's always very specific, very detailed proposals that are voted upon. If they are approved, they become federal law. If they're rejected, nothing changes. So oftentimes the main argument is pure pragmatism. So economies of scale are one of the reasons why things get centralized. So that pertains also to the public radio and TV broadcasting company. It's true that unlike other, for instance, in Germany, it's the Länder that together run the ARD and ZDF. In Switzerland, it's a federal domain because it was decided that the market was too small. And if each canton, being so small, decides on its own radio and TV program, it's not going to work. So let the federal government deal with it, which also means that the federal government has to raise the money to finance the public TV and radio. So it's always rights and obligations that come together. So for the cantons, if the federal government takes over, it also means that the federal government pays, that it's the federal government that has to ask for a tax increase, either through the VAT or through direct tax or other duties, and not the canton. So they will be off the hook if the federal government takes over a task. So it's good and bad, this centralization issue. But the main reason is really pragmatism and the need for, and the hope that through economies of scale, it's cheaper to have one solution rather than 25 or 26 or 7 or 8 regional solutions. You asked about overview of bilingual legislation. So there are some complaints once in a while by the minority speakers that the quality of their laws is not the same as had it been written originally, because most of the stuff is drafted in German and then translated. But overall, it's not a major issue. Probably also because the French speakers, which are a minority overall, they are a majority in two of the 3 bilingual cantons. And there is also a stronger tendency for university education, especially in the legal domain, among the French speakers. So there are more French-speaking lawyers proportionally than German-speaking lawyers. So the know-how is actually greater on the side of the minority to do proper translations or even first drafts. I'm not aware of any overview of the actual quality of the bilingual translation, but it's not been a major issue, which tells me as a political scientist that it's okay. You asked about the 2 chambers, and that's also a question somebody else asked. So the 2 chambers have exactly the same powers. So every law or every proposal, every decree that needs parliamentary consent needs to be approved by the 2 chambers in separate sessions in the exact same form. So typically, it's the Council of States, the Senate, that accepts and treats the draft law first, and then it's sent to the 2nd chamber. And if the 2nd chamber does not agree, it comes back. If the 1st chamber maintains its initial opinion, it goes back to the 2nd chamber, up to 3 times in each chamber. If each chamber insists 3 times on its proposal, there is a conciliation committee. 15 people from either chamber are sent into that conciliation committee, and their task is to produce a compromise. But this compromise, again, needs to be approved by each chamber in a separate session. And if one of the 2 chambers, whichever it is, rejects the compromise solution, then there is no solution. Then all was in vain. So the 2 chambers have the exact same legislative powers, legislative powers. So it's a bit different for elections, because electing the government, the two chambers come together in joint session. So you have the 200 national councillors and the senators, they move into the chamber and they sit at the back. Now, obviously 46 is less than 200. So you can say that the weight of the National Council is 4 times that of the senators in electing the members of government. But that's only in the specific instance of elections. When it comes to legislation, perfectly the same powers. And the cantons, maybe I misunderstood the question, but the cantons are proportionally represented only in the lower chamber with the 200 members. So the biggest canton, Canton of Zurich, has 35 national councillors elected in the Canton of Zurich, whereas the smallest cantons, the 6 smallest cantons, actually have just 1 national councillor out of 200. So basically the cantons do not play a role, the small cantons do not play a role in the lower chamber. But in the Senate, every canton has 2 seats. So Canton of Zurich, with 1.5 million inhabitants, has 2 senators. The canton I'm from, Canton of Glarus, with 30,000 inhabitants, has 2 senators, and all of the same weight in the plenary of the Senate. I hope that answers that question. On the treaties, there was a question on the treaties. So the question was actually very good. I mean, all the questions are good, but that's particularly a good question because we don't have the answer. When all the 26 cantons cooperate, does it spark a debate to assigning powers to the federal level? It could actually be that case, but as far as I'm aware, there is no specific example of that this took place. Because if the 26 cantons get together and sign a treaty, which has to be ratified either by the cantonal parliaments or by the cantonal electorate, depends on the canton, that's really an achievement. And it is used politically to show that the cantons can solve it. There is no need for the federal level. Actually, the cantons oftentimes cooperate to avoid centralization. And only if this cooperation really does not work, because new issues have arisen, or for instance, one case could be cyber warfare. If really it were to be the case in the next 2 or 3 years, that this issue of cyber warfare becomes such a pressing issue that it should better be federalized, then it will be federalized. But it's very rare that if already the cantons cooperate, that it's centralized. Now, you asked me to assess which powers should remain where they are. And that's also something that I'll repeat later on. It's a political process. And I'm not an economist, so I don't have this economies of scale, what's the ideal level. To me, when all the actors involved are happy with the solution, that's the ideal solution. So if everybody feels that there are 3 treaties in Switzerland regulating the use of prisons, so that's a real example. So the cantons have their own prisons. There is one treaty for the French-speaking part of Switzerland that regulates where prisoners can be sent within the French-speaking part. There is one for the East, and there's one for Central Switzerland. If it works, if the actors involved, if the people involved feel that this is the way to go, I have no problem whatsoever that we have 3 prison systems in Switzerland. It's not beautiful. It maybe looks complicated at first sight, but if it works, then it works. Who are we, or who am I to say that it should be different? The same to the fiscal level. So the cantons collect the taxes. So maybe I should have specified that. So the cantons collect all the direct taxes, income and property. And then they hand over the federal share to the federal government at the end of the year or whenever they do that. But the indirect taxes, so the VAT, the value added tax, or the import duties, or the tax on the fuel at the petrol station, that's collected by the vendor and directly sent to the federal tax administration. So the indirect tax does not go through the canton level. It's collected by the vendor or retained by the vendor and then sent to the federal administration. The same for the import duties. The cantons are not involved in the import duties. It's the federal customs administration that collects the import duties. And you mentioned the interpersonal solidarity. We have the same I think, system as you have with social insurances. So the social insurances are apart. So typically you have the federal, regional or cantonal and the local finances, and you have the social insurances. And contributions to the social insurances are directly taken off the salary at the end of the month and sent to the social insurances, which are federal institutions, but they're sort of semi-autonomous organizations that operate across the whole territory. So they're outside of federalism, but obviously they are national in institutions. So my personal assessment is that this division of labor works very well in the Swiss case. The cantons, they're closest, they have the administration, they have the manpower to check the tax declaration. So the cantons collect the direct taxation and they send the part to the federal level. That's fine. The federal level collects the indirect taxes. That's fine. And the social insurances, they get the money from the employers and they deal and they have the overview of how much they get and how much they spend, and that's fine. So this division of labor, it makes sense to me, but again, since it has not been contested so far, it seems to work, but obviously you're free to advocate for whichever system you prefer. That's just my personal opinion as a political scientist. And again, maybe economically, there are different ways of doing it better. Then I had 5 questions, of which the first one pertained to the public radio and TV. So economies of scale was the main reason why a national radio and TV station was created initially in the 1950s. And then the system has been changed over time. So for instance, initially you only had to pay the TV and radio fee if you actually owned a TV and a radio set. 5 years ago, that was changed. Now every household pays a TV and radio fee, even if you do not have a TV or radio in your household. There was a law changed by Parliament. It was contested by some organizations, mainly on the right. And there was a razor-thin majority in favor of the new law. 50.3% of the people approved that change. So the reason is a majority was in favor of that system, including the fiscal transfer from the larger to the smaller regions, linguistic regions, for the purpose of TV and radio. Then there was a question on which I think is more about jurisdiction and not legislation, because the way it was translated was legislation is entirely cantonal, but as we said, each level has its own competences and each level makes the laws for its own domains, but it's really jurisdiction. So the court system, there are no federal courts in the districts. So there are cantonal courts of first instance, there are cantonal courts of last instance, and if you're still not happy with the decision, you can take it to the federal tribunal. So the Supreme Court of Switzerland, although it's not a constitutional court, it is still the court of last instance for all the domains, whether that's federal law or cantonal law or local law. Everything ends at the federal court, which incidentally is not in Bern, but it's in Lausanne, in the French-speaking city, because it was decided to give each area a little bit of this aura of federal institutions. So that's the court of last instance. Human rights issues can be taken even further to Strasbourg, but only in the domain of the European Convention of Human Rights. The pandemic, I mean, that's one of the questions that the odds are still out. So you're perfectly right. That was absolutely a stress test for Swiss federalism, or every country, indeed. Now, in the first wave, the federal government completely took over. The federal parliament even decided to dissolve itself because they did not want to set the example of meeting in the federal parliament. So the federal parliament disbanded itself and left the floor entirely to the federal executive. So not only the federal level, but even the federal executive, the 7 ministers, and then among the 7, the health minister took over entirely and decided, we have a lockdown, you have to work from home, and all the things that were decided very harshly or very strictly in the first wave. Now, in the second wave onwards, so wave 2, 3, 4, 5, that was different, because a part of the strong federalist counter-reaction was, we're a federal country, you cannot impose the same solutions across the whole territory. It's true, in the first wave, most cases happened or the incidence was much greater in the Italian-speaking part and in the French-speaking part. So the feeling on the side of the German speakers was, why do we have to undergo all these restrictions and lockdown and close the restaurants if we are not so much affected? So in the second wave onwards, the federal government tried to have regionally tailored solutions, but honestly, it didn't really work because cantons were afraid to take decisions that would hurt their businesses. Being smaller, they were also more susceptible to influence from the powerful regional interests. And I say it didn't work because then the cases just exploded, and the cantons, especially the smaller cantons, couldn't handle all this contact tracing and vaccination administration and preparation. Each canton tried to have their own portal to register for the vaccination, instead of having one national portal with enough firepower that would handle the demand. So obviously these portals, they just crashed in the smaller cantons, especially. Over time, so with the boosters, then they kind of made good, because then they had all the infrastructure in place. So the booster wave then again although it was cantonal, that worked in the end. So in the end, Swiss federalism was able to save face. In the first wave, it disappeared for good because it worked well with a centralized solution. In between, there were a lot of troubles, as I said, also with this war of the white restaurants. Federal government said you have to close the restaurants. Canton saying, but you told us we could decide on the ski resorts autonomously, including the restaurants. No, but yes, but no, but yes, but. And then in the end, they came to some kind of solution. Constitutional conflicts between the federal and the constitutional and the cantonal constitution. So when a canton changes its constitution, each canton has a constitution, and the federal level says that to change a cantonal constitution, the cantonal people need to agree. So the federal level mandates this direct democracy onto the cantons. They had it anyway, they had it before the federal level, but it's just a safeguard that the cantons do not drift off in non-direct democratic ways. So if a canton decides to change the constitution, that always means that the cantonal people or a majority have agreed to that. And then it's sent to Bern, to the federal parliament. And the federal parliament, not the constitutional court, not the federal government, but the federal parliament, the two chambers in separate sessions, need to consent to this change of the cantonal constitution. It's called to guarantee the constitutional change. So it's a purely political process. If the cantonal parliament, so there was one case when the canton of Jura was created in the 1970s as a mini secession from the canton of Bern, because they felt their linguistic rights were not adequately protected, by the way. So when this was done, the new constitution of Jura had an article that the authorities should do everything in their power to reunite the lost territories into the new canton. And the federal parliament said, by all means, that goes against the federal constitution. So they accepted the entire constitution, but not that article. There was no way to appeal against that decision because it's not foreseen. First of all, it's not foreseen that the federal parliament rejects cantonal constitutional change, but when they do, there is no way to appeal. Again, it's much more political than legal in that sense. Why then the final question from that batch of five question was, so there are so many differences between the cantons. Why this symmetry, the legal symmetry? The simple answer is Napoleon. So in the old times, before the French Revolution, we had a great degree of asymmetry. Some cantons were very powerful and rich and were among the leading centers of entire Europe. Others were small valley communities. Napoleon, or the French invasion of Switzerland in 1798, did away with the feudalism and the oligarchical tendencies, and simplified overnight, made a unitary state. That did not work. So the compromise then was the cantons can remain cantons, but the old colonies, subject territories, were upgraded to the status of cantons. So in a way, the legal symmetry we have until this day is a compromise between the old regime, when you had 13 cantons dominating subject territories, and a perfectly unitary system under the French occupation, where the cantons had disappeared. It was like a mini France. So the compromise is we have 26 cantons, although they are very different. Legally, they're the same. Then questions on similarities and differences. The national parties. So financial transfers between the cantons and debate between the left and the right. So basically the left, the Swiss left, they because they want to ensure that everybody has the same opportunities regardless of where they live. I'll give you a very specific example. Subsidies to study, so student grants, because higher education is a cantonal domain. Each canton decides whether they give out grants to study at university, who they give the grants to, and how much they pay and under what conditions. So we have 26 different grant systems for studying at the university. The left, people on the left thought that's not okay, because obviously the conservative cantons, they're more stingy, and the progressive cantons, they're more generous. And couldn't we all go to the level of the more progressive cantons to enable everybody to study at the university? The fees are not very high, but you still, depending on where you live, you still need to pay rent and live. So you still need money if you don't have. So they decided that they proposed a solution that would nationalize, that would give the federal level the power to propose student subsidies, take the power away from the cantons. But an overwhelming majority of 70 or 65% of the people and of the cantons rejected that solution. And these are debates that continue taking place. There is a proposal from the left or from the right, and typically it's contested in a popular vote, and then the people decide, or the people and the cantons, if it's a constitutional change. Now, if I said in the beginning that the parliament and the government can propose constitutional change, that's true, but they don't have the monopoly. You can also change the constitution by collecting 100,000 signatures within 18 months. So anybody with the right to vote in Swiss, at the Swiss federal level can launch this process. You need to be a committee of 5 citizens. You announce the text of what you want to put in the constitution or take out or simply change. There is a formal check. So for instance, you cannot propose an article to the constitution that says we should all drink Coca-Cola. So there is a formal text, publicities are not allowed. But other than that, it's pretty limitless of what you can propose. It's called the popular initiative. It's like the European Citizens Initiative, except that the popular initiative always comes to a vote. Whatever the parliament says, whatever the government says, whatever any of the parties say, there is always a vote if you have the 100,000 signatures in 18 months, and that vote is binding. So even if everybody from the elite is against that proposal and the majority of citizens and cantons, because you changed the constitution, is in favor, then the constitution is changed. And that typically means centralization, because you propose a new solution at federal level of something that either has been done before by the cantons or that has not been done at all by any of the levels. So if you want, the Swiss system is the opposite of your very rigid 2-step approach that you described. Basically, anyone can propose a constitutional change, including the parliament, including the parties, but it needs a popular vote. And if the popular vote is decisive, then that's it. There is no way to contest the decision. So you might say it's still very hard because you need the resources to collect signatures and have the campaign, and it takes time, 5, 6, 7 years. but at the same time, it's easy because at least formally, there's no gatekeeper, such as the parliament in your case, that decides what can be changed and what not. You asked about linguistic groups. So the question was whether linguistic groups can push for a decision at the federal level. They can, but not as a group. So there are no group rights. There is no alarm bell procedure for French-speaking members of parliament. There are no collective rights, if you want. You can push for a decision at the federal level as 50,000 citizens. You can contest an act of parliament. And of course, that can be 50,000 French-speaking citizens or Italian-speaking citizens or German-speaking citizens, but they would sign the contestation as citizens and not as members of the French speakers. The same for MPs. So if a majority of, if French MPs, French-speaking MPs are against a decision, they cannot, as French MPs, contest the decision, but they have to find non-French MPs because proportional representation being what it is, they have only 23% of the MPs. They would need to find German-speaking MPs to vote with them. Canton of Bern so at the canton level, we have an alarm bell procedure. And at the canton level, there is a great more variety also of linguistic protective mechanism, but I think it would go too far away if we now also go to the cantonal level because there are 26. So at the Swiss level, no alarm bell procedures. For groups as groups, but obviously for citizens and for cantons, there are equivalents to contestation mechanisms. Perfectly right with the benefits of unity versus the cost of heterogeneity, and linguistic differences are one of the factors that influence this calculation. In Switzerland, the solution is political. If a majority in parliament decides on a new law and a large group is against, there will be a referendum, and the referendum, the popular vote, decides whether the law is accepted or not. The same for constitutional change, where you have a popular vote anyway. Now that's tiresome, and that takes a lot of time, but it has some benefits in that it brings people together across the entire country. So because French-speaking citizens of Geneva and German-speaking citizens up in the mountains, they vote on the same issue on the same day, they have something in common beyond the linguistic issue. About the minorities at local level, I said, so it's fixed, so the linguistic borders are fixed. And I know they're also fixed in Belgium, but then they turned out not to be so fixed. Now in Switzerland, they might also turn out not to be so fixed, but it's the municipalities that are autonomous to decide what is the official language on their territory or the official languages. So it's left to the autonomy of the lower levels. Federal government says, cantons, you decide what language you have on your territory, and the cantons tell their municipalities, you decide what language you want to have as the official language. So it can change over time, but it's always a decision by the community in the specific territory. And the question was also, what do people think about that? Well, most people don't even know about that because it's not an issue, because the borders have remained fixed. And it's clear as a German speaker, if you go to French-speaking canton, well, it will be French. Everything will be French. Because the canton is so important and you deal mainly with the canton, everything will be in French. That's the price to pay. And then you have to decide individually, is it worth going there for a better job, or do I maybe commute? I mean, we must also remember that the train system is very well developed. And from Zurich to Geneva, it takes you 2.5 hours. And it's basically 2/3 of the country that you have crossed. And with home office, it's even easier not to move just for job reasons. Government elections. So as I said, so you have the two chambers that come together and they elect the government. And the very interesting question was, why is the Green Party, for instance, not there? So that's exactly the question that members of the Green Party obviously also go on about, and perfectly justified, because the system, it's called magic formula. So basically, the idea is that all the major parties are included in the government. That's the basic idea. Why are they included in the government? Because if they're not included in the government, they will use the direct democratic instruments to attack and challenge solutions found in parliament. So better include them before it's too late. And since between 1959 and roughly speaking 2000, the four major parties were socialists with 2 seats, the liberals with 2 seats, and the Christian Democrats with 2 seats, and the conservatives with 1 seat. Since the 1990s, there has been a small change. So the center has lost to the profit of the right, of the conservatives. So the center had to give 1 seat to the Conservative Party. And effectively speaking, at the last election, we saw the Green Party becoming the 5th largest party, and not so far behind the 4th largest party, the former Christian Democrats, which are now the centrists. So the Green Party are perfectly justified in asking, why don't we have a seat if the centrists that are not far ahead of us have 1 seat? The standard answer so far has been, it's not enough for a political party to win an election. They also need to win the next election and the next election to be considered for inclusion in the federal government. Again, it takes us back to changes happen very, very slowly. The Conservative Party, they won the elections in 1995. They won the elections in 1999, but only once they won the elections of 2003 were they given a 2nd seat in the federal government. There is no way to contest that decision because it's the MPs that decide and elect the members of government in complete freedom. Elections are secret also, so we don't know who votes for whom. And so far it has been consensus that you need to not win 1 election or 2, but in fact 3 elections to be even considered for a seat in the federal government. I think if they win again in 2 years, we will have the federal elections in a year and a half, they will be given a seat at the federal executive table. But we should also say that even without the Greens being members of the executive, the government still represents 70% of the entire electorate. It went down from 80 to 70%. Okay, it's minus 10%, but it's still much more than in other countries, and it's still a high share of the electorate that is represented through these 4 parties. They do not sign an agreement. There is no coalition agreement. That's why I wrote on the slides a de facto coalition, because they are put together by the parliament and they have to make it work, taking into consideration linguistic affiliation, cantonal affiliation. Historically, religion played a role. Now it's much more gender. So there should also be a kind of gender balance in electing new members to the federal government. So all these factors play a role and they determine who is then elected. But there is no coalition agreement. There is a legislative program that the government presents, but it's just a piece of paper because it's so imprevisible, the Swiss legislative process, because it has initiatives. You have evolutions at the European Union level. Frontex, we will have a referendum on the changes to Frontex. That's not something that the federal government could have foreseen in their coalition agreement 2 or 3 years ago. So a coalition agreement would not make sense because the government does not have the monopoly over the agenda. Individuals can also put stuff on the agenda, interest groups, and also the cantons. They can also send stuff and demand things. Decisions in parliament, everything is simple majority. So there are no alternative thresholds, 2/3 or something. So even if the parliament decides to change the constitution, it's a simple majority. With constitutions, the added obstacle is that you need a popular majority and a cantonal majority. But basically within parliament, it's simple majorities. So the majority of whoever is there, except since 2008, there is a debt break. So the parliament imposed upon itself stricter budget discipline. So basically the expenses, I don't know the exact details, but basically the expenses cannot be higher than something. And to break through that break, you need an absolute majority. So you need more than half of all the members. So in the National Council with 200 members, to break through that break, you need 101 people in favor of whatever measure is proposed that overspends what the government should be allowed. But that's the only exception, this absolute majority to break through the debt brake. I said that it's really a bicameral system, and actually, if you look at, so we did that, we looked at the legislative process, and others have looked at it before. Of the two chambers, the Senate is actually slightly more powerful. So the smaller chamber, because it is smaller, it is more homogeneous. The center parties are stronger. Individual senators are in more committees, so it's easier for them to reach a consensus solution, which means they're finished more quickly. So when the question is a new proposal arrives, which of the two chambers should deal with it first? It's more often the Senate, because they are better at working down their staple of papers. And even compromise solutions by the committees, conciliation committees, tend to reflect the viewpoint of the Senate more than of the National Council. So the Senate is not only as powerful, but actually more powerful through the back door than the National Council. As I said, you mentioned this example about whether decisions are binding. So I think the example you had in mind with the European treaties was the Swiss People's Party, the Conservative Party, the largest party. They proposed a constitutional change that there should be quotas on the number of immigrants every year. They didn't say what quota, what the percentage should be, but they just said there should be quotas for the number of immigrants that are allowed to enter and work and live in Switzerland every year. So that's a proposal by the right-wing party. A majority of people and cantons accepted that proposal. So the constitution was changed, although parliament was against it, government was against it. The constitution was changed. But what happens with constitutional change is then it is for the parliament to specify how to apply that general idea there should be a quota. Now, in that specific case, the mass immigration initiative, in that specific case, the parliament basically decided to ignore the will of the people, or let's say interpret it in a very creative way, by forcing employers to announce vacancies through the regional job placement agencies first, and only then publish them online, accessible for everybody. So the federal government had actually the task to introduce a quota, but that quota would have violated the agreement with the European Union on the free movement of persons, where it's free, there is no limit. So the federal government, caught between a rock and a hard place, they decided to go with a flexible interpretation and interpret the mandate of the people in a way that did not violate the treaty with the European Union. The Swiss People's Party said, you're all traitors, and launched a new initiative. But that new initiative failed at the polls. Majority of people rejected it. So now the issue is off the agenda. That's how the stuff gets solved in Switzerland. You force a referendum, and then once the referendum is over, it's over, because the next issue is already on the horizon. I think that was it. I ran out of questions.
Ja, dank u wel. Ik denk dat u zeer uitgebreid hebt geantwoord op alle vragen. Ook heel duidelijk, heel interessant. Ik weet niet of dat er nog leden zijn die bijkomende vragen hebben of verduidelijkingen. Nee? Nee, professor, er zijn geen verdere vragen meer. En dan wil ik u namens ons allen van harte bedanken voor uw omstandige en zeer duidelijke uitleg. En ik wens u nog alle succes toe.
Thank you very much, and good luck with your work and with everything.
Okay, thank you. Bye.